Picture this: a nobleman, dressed in the finest silks of the court, trading his gold-embroidered cloak for the coarse, dirt-stained tunic of a peasant. No servants, no titles, no privileges, just the anonymity of the common folk. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but in medieval Europe, this wasn't just fantasy. It was a daring reality. For centuries, kings, queens, and lords stepped out of their gilded halls and into the muddy streets, hiding their identities to walk among the people they ruled. But why? What could possibly compel the most powerful figures of their time to risk everything, their safety, their status, even their lives, just to live as peasants, even for a short while? The answer is as surprising as it is profound. These weren't just whims or games. These disguises were calculated moves, bold experiments that reshaped kingdoms, sparked rebellions, and rewrote history itself. Think about the world these nobles inhabited, a world where the divide between the rich and the poor wasn't just economic. It was a chasm of misunderstanding. The wealthy lived in castles, insulated from hunger, disease, and the daily struggles of their subjects. They made laws, levied taxes, and waged wars, all without ever truly knowing the people those decisions affected. But a handful of them dared to ask, what if they could see the world through the eyes of those they ruled? What if they could hear the unspoken grievances, witness the hidden suffering, and understand the lives of the people who built their kingdoms with their bare hands? So they did the unthinkable. They shed their titles, disguised their faces, and stepped into the shadows. And what they discovered in those shadows didn't just change their perspectives. It changed the course of history. From the crowded marketplaces of France to the frostbitten villages of Russia, these undercover nobles uncovered truths that would have otherwise remained hidden. They saw corruption festering in plain sight, felt the sting of unfair laws, and heard the whispers of rebellion long before they reached the throne. Some returned with compassion, enacting reforms that lifted thousands out of poverty. Others uncovered plots that threatened their very crowns, and a few, the most cunning of them all, used their disguises not just to observe, but to manipulate, turning the tables on their enemies in ways no one saw coming. This is the untold story of power, deception, and the moments when the mighty chose to walk among the meek, not out of pity, but out of necessity. Because sometimes, to rule wisely, you first have to see the world as your subjects do. And that's exactly what we're about to explore. The tradition of nobles hiding in plain sight stretches back further than most people realize, long before the grand castles and sprawling courts of the High Middle Ages. In fact, some of the earliest tales come not from history books, but from myths and legends whispered around firesides. Take the story of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway in the 9th century. According to sagas, he often traveled in disguise, listening to the grievances of fishermen and farmers to root out corrupt officials who abused his name. Even then, rulers understood that truth rarely reached a throne unaltered. But this wasn't just a Norse phenomenon. Over in England, Alfred the Great famously infiltrated Danish camps during the Viking invasions, gathering intelligence while dressed as a wandering minstrel. His survival and eventual victories depended on his ability to blend in. Yet these early examples weren't just about espionage or survival. They tapped into something deeper, a cultural fascination with the idea that true wisdom came from seeing the world stripped of privilege. Medieval literature brimmed with stories of kings and knights humbled by time spent as beggars or laborers. Think of Arthurian legends where nobility was proven through hardship. This motif wasn't accidental. In societies built on rigid hierarchies, the act of a ruler shedding their status carried immense symbolic weight. It suggested that leadership wasn't just about divine right, but about earning respect through understanding. By the 12th century, the practice had evolved beyond myth into political strategy. Helena of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her time, reportedly disguised herself as a peasant to travel safely through hostile territories. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa used similar tactics to inspect the loyalty of his vassals firsthand. What began as necessity or curiosity slowly became a tool of governance, one that revealed uncomfortable truth. When nobles saw their own laws enforced by corrupt sheriffs, or witnessed families starving under unfair taxes, these weren't abstract reports anymore. They were memories etched in dirt and hunger. Perhaps most strikingly, some rulers didn't just observe, they participated. Records from 13th century France tell of Count Raymond of Toulouse working incognito alongside vineyard laborers for an entire harvest. He later revised feudal contracts to reduce their burdens, citing the back-breaking toil he'd shared. These weren't fleeting gestures, they were deliberate acts of immersion, reshaping policies that had been written in the comfort of candlelit chambers. Of course, not every noble had pure motives. For every ruler seeking reform, another used disguises to uncover plots or test loyalty. But whether driven by empathy or suspicion, one thing became clear: power looked different from the ground up. And those who dared to change their vantage point often changed history in the process. Imagine being a medieval ruler sitting in your castle, surrounded by advisors who tell you only what they think you want to hear. How could you ever know the real mood of your people, whether they were loyal, discontent, or secretly planning revolt? For many nobles, the answer was simple: go find out yourself. Disguised as a beggar, a merchant, or a traveling laborer, they slipped into crowds, their ears open to whispers that never reached the throne. This wasn't just curiosity, it was survival. In an age without newspapers or spies embedded in every village, rulers who wanted the truth had to risk walking straight into it. Take the case of Ivan the Terrible, one of Russia's most feared tsars. Despite his ruthless reputation, he was known to wander Moscow's streets in the ragged clothes of a commoner, listening to conversations in taverns and market squares. On one such outing, he overheard a group of merchants complaining about corrupt officials extorting bribes. Instead of punishing the merchants for speaking out, Ivan used their information to purge his own administration, executing the guilty and reclaiming stolen wealth for the state. It was a stark lesson. The crown's greatest threat sometimes came not from rebels or invaders, but from the greed of those closest to power. But intelligence gathering wasn't just about rooting out corruption. For some monarchs, it was a matter of life and death. During the tumultuous Wars of the Roses in England, Edward IV famously disguised himself as a servant to escape capture after a battlefield defeat. Later, he used similar tactics to gauge the loyalty of his subjects, moving undetected through towns to test whether they still supported his claim to the throne. His disguises weren't just clever, they were crucial to his eventual return to power. Perhaps the most cunning use of peasant disguise came from France's Louis XI, a king so skilled in deception that he earned the nickname the Spider. He didn't just dress down, he perfected the art of blending in, adopting regional dialects and mannerisms to move unnoticed through his kingdom. On one occasion, he learned of a brewing rebellion not from his advisors, but from a group of farmers complaining about taxes while he pretended to mend a fence nearby. By the time the plotters made their move, Louis had already dismantled their network, arresting the ringleaders before a single sword was drawn. These stories reveal a darker truth beneath the glamour of medieval courts. Rulers lived in constant fear of betrayal. A noble's fine clothes and titles were both their armor and their blindfold. Removing them even temporarily gave rulers something no amount of gold could buy: the unfiltered truth. And in a world where misinformation could topple dynasties, that truth was more valuable than any crown. A king walking through his own kingdom unrecognized, it's a scene straight out of legend, yet history shows us it happened more often than we might think. Take King Alfred the Great, who didn't just spy on his enemies in disguise. He used his anonymity to witness the daily lives of his subjects. One famous tale tells of him taking shelter in a peasant's hut during his wars against the Vikings, where he supposedly burned the family's bread while lost in thought. A humble moment immortalized in stories as a reminder that even kings could falter without their servants. But Alfred's time in disguise wasn't just about survival. It shaped his vision for England. After seeing how poorly defended villages suffered under Viking raids, he reorganized his kingdom's defenses, creating a network of fortified towns that would later become the backbone of English resistance. His reforms didn't come from abstract strategy. They came from the dirt roads he walked and the conversations he overheard while dressed as a common traveler. Then there's Harun al-Rashid, the legendary Abbasid caliph who ruled at the height of the Islamic Golden Age. By day, he presided over a court of unparalleled wealth and scholarship in Baghdad. By night, he was said to roam the city's alleys in simple garb, listening to merchants, beggars, and craftsmen. These outings weren't just royal whims. They were his way of cutting through the layers of bureaucracy to hear unfiltered grievances. When he discovered corrupt officials taxing the poor beyond reason, he didn't just replace them. He restructured the tax system entirely, easing burdens on the most vulnerable. His night walks became so famous they inspired tales in 1001 Nights, blurring the line between history and myth. But the core truth remained. Rulers who stepped outside their palaces often returned with policies that reflected reality, not just privilege. What's striking about these stories isn't just the disguises, it's the humility they required. Imagine a king used to unquestioned obedience, enduring the indifference or even scorn of people who didn't recognize him. For Alfred, it meant hearing complaints about his own rule without the power to silence critics. For Harun, it meant witnessing hunger in the shadow of his own lavish palace. These weren't passive observations, they were confrontations with the limits of power. A decree from a throne could command obedience, but it couldn't guarantee justice unless the ruler understood the lives it affected. That's why their legacies endured. Alfred's legal reforms emphasized fairness and education, rooted in the struggles he'd seen. Harun's reign became synonymous with prosperity because he redirected wealth from the elite to public works like hospitals and libraries, projects born from his nights among the people. Of course, not every disguised ruler acted selflessly. Some used their anonymity to test loyalty, rewarding subjects who showed kindness to a stranger and punishing those who didn't. Others, like the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, blended in to inspect infrastructure, ensuring roads and bridges were maintained, not out of charity but because efficient trade lined royal coffers. Yet even these pragmatic rulers inadvertently revealed a truth. A kingdom thrived when its leader saw it through the eyes of those who built it. The most enduring reforms, the laws that lasted, the systems that functioned often traced back to moments when crowns were left behind and rulers traded silks for calloused hands and listening ears. Sometimes the truth a noble uncovered in disguise was too dangerous to ignore and too explosive to contain. That's what happened in 14th century Flanders, when a wealthy count disguised himself as a wool worker to investigate why tax revenues from the region had plummeted. What he found wasn't laziness or dishonesty, but something far more volatile, a simmering class war. The Count watched as foremen pocketed workers' wages, as merchants fixed prices to starve out small farms, and as his own officials turned blind eyes to the abuse. But when he returned to his castle and demanded reforms, his courtiers resisted, profiting too much from the corruption to let it end. Word of his failed intervention spread through the workshops and fields, igniting a fury among peasants who now knew their ruler had seen the injustice and hadn't stopped it. Within months, full-scale revolts erupted, with rebels specifically citing the Count's own disguised observations as proof that change was possible. His attempt to quietly fix the system had instead exposed its rot, handing rebels the moral high ground. The same pattern played out centuries later in Bohemia, where Archduke Ferdinand II decided to tour his lands as a humble pilgrim. He expected to hear praise for his policies. Instead, he found villages where families huddled in ruined churches, their homes seized to pay debts to his own tax collectors. When he ordered leniency, local nobles refused, claiming the peasants were exaggerating. But the Archduke had seen the hunger in children's eyes himself, and his frustrated outbursts in court only confirmed the rumors that even the crown knew the system was broken. Peasant leaders, sensing weakness, rallied their followers with a chilling question. If even the Archduke can't control his own officials, why should we obey them? The resulting uprising nearly toppled his reign, proving that a noble's disguise could become a double-edged sword. Once subjects realized their ruler had witnessed their suffering firsthand, patience turned to fury when change didn't come. Perhaps the most ironic case came from England's peasants' revolt of 1381. Chronicles suggest King Richard II's own spies, disguised as laborers, had infiltrated rebel meetings to gather intelligence. But instead of just reporting back, these agents began sympathizing with the rebels' demands for fair wages and an end to serfdom. Some even joined the marching crowds, their noble educations helping craft petitions that framed peasant grievances in legal terms the crown couldn't easily dismiss. When Richard finally met the rebels face to face, he was stunned by their articulate arguments, unaware his own men had helped shape them. The revolt was crushed violently, but the king's later reforms mirrored many rebel demands, suggesting even failed uprisings left marks on rulers who'd seen the world through their subjects' eyes. These stories reveal a cruel twist of fate. The very act of seeking truth could unravel the fabric of power. A noble in disguise wasn't just an observer, they became an unwitnessed witness, their presence proof that injustice wasn't some vague rumor, but a reality even the elite couldn't deny. And once that truth escaped into the streets, it took on a life of its own, turning whispers into shouts and grievances into revolutions. The lesson was clear. Rulers who walked among their people risked more than their safety. They risked exposing the fragility of the systems that kept them in power. For some, that knowledge led to reform. For others, it sparked fires they could never fully control. For every noble who used a disguise as a political tool, there were those who crossed a line their peers couldn't fathom. They never came back. These weren't temporary experiments in empathy or espionage. They were complete surrenders of power, wealth, and identity. Take the case of Duke Wenceslaus of Bohemia in the 15th century, a man who didn't just dress as a farmer for a season, he became one. After years of feuding with rival nobles and witnessing the devastation their wars inflicted on peasants, he stunned his court by signing away his lands, putting on a laborer's smock, and joining a village cooperative. Chroniclers wrote that he refused to even answer to his title, insisting on being called by the name he'd chosen, Jan the Plowman. While other nobles saw peasant life as a temporary disguise, Wenceslaus embraced it as penance, spending his last decades tilling soil he once taxed. His former subjects whispered that he seemed happier with calloused hands than he ever had been with a scepter. Then there's the bittersweet tale of Lady Isabella de Courcy, a French noblewoman who vanished from court in the 1300s, not to escape an arranged marriage as rumor first claimed, but to follow one. After secretly falling in love with a stonemason hired to renovate her family's chateau, she staged her own death in a hunting accident and fled to his village. When a traveling monk recognized her years later, she was nursing their third child in a one-room cottage, her once delicate fingers scarred from laundry lye and wool carding. The monk, expecting to find a woman trapped in regret, instead wrote of her laughing as she taught her children to mend fishing nets, a skill she'd learned from neighbors who never knew her as anything but Marie the Weaver. Unlike Wenceslaus, whose transformation was rooted in guilt, Isabella's was an act of defiance against the rigid expectations of her birth. But perhaps the most radical case came from medieval Japan, where the samurai Takedo Shingen's heir, Katsuyori, abandoned his clan not for love or remorse, but for a spiritual awakening. After a battlefield vision in which he believed the Buddha showed him the suffering caused by his family's wars, he cut his topknot, burned his armor, and walked into the mountains as a wandering monk. For decades, peasants spoke of a gentle ascetic who helped build terraced fields in remote villages until an aging warrior passing through recognized the distinctive scar on the monk's wrist, revealing him as the lost heir. Katsuyori's response: he thanked the soldier for the memory, then returned to hoeing barley. His former retainers, sent to beg him to reclaim his title, left empty-handed after he told them, "A man who has carried water for the thirsty cannot again carry swords for the powerful." What unites these stories isn't just the rejection of privilege, it's the profound discomfort they caused among those who stayed behind. Wenceslaus's former vassals spread rumors he'd gone mad, unable to accept that he might genuinely prefer simplicity. Isabella's family, upon learning the truth, declared her legally dead to avoid scandal, scrubbing her name from genealogies, and Katsuyori's clan rewrote histories to frame his departure as exile, not choice. These nobles turned peasants held up a mirror to their societies, forcing an unsettling question. If privilege didn't guarantee happiness, what was the point of clinging to it? Their legacies lived on in ballads and folktales, where they became symbols of a truth too radical for their time, that power could be something you walked away from, not just something you wielded. And in doing so, they proved that the most shocking disguise of all wasn't a costume, but the courage to stop pretending. While kings and dukes dominate most tales of disguised nobility, history holds equally remarkable stories of women who traded silk for homespun cloth, often at far greater personal risk. Queens and noblewomen didn't just observe peasant life, they navigated it with the added peril of gender expectations that made their disguises doubly dangerous. Consider Margaret of Denmark, who ruled as regent in the 15th century. Frustrated by advisors dismissing reports of famine, she disguised herself as a merchant's wife and traveled to afflicted regions. What she encountered wasn't just hunger, it was a web of exploitation, with local lords hoarding grain to inflate prices while mothers bartered wedding rings for a loaf of bread. But unlike male rulers who could blend into tavern crowds, Margaret had to maintain an elaborate backstory. A wandering woman invited suspicion. A merchant's wife checking on her husband's trade routes did not. Her resulting grain distribution laws saved thousands, yet chroniclers barely noted her undercover mission, a telling silence about how women's political cunning was often erased. For some noblewomen, peasant disguise wasn't just a tool of governance, it was an escape hatch from lives others had scripted for them. In 12th century Castile, Infanta Urraca fled an abusive betrothal by disguising herself as a pilgrim, joining a group of women traveling to Santiago de Compostela. The ruse worked because no one expected a princess to know how to mend her own shoes or cook over a campfire, skills she'd secretly learned from her maid. 2 years later, when she resurfaced to claim her inheritance, her time among commoners became her greatest asset. She'd mastered the rhythms of trade routes, the unwritten codes of rural justice, and the art of persuasion without royal authority. Her later reign was marked by unprecedented legal protections for peasant women, including the right to refuse marriages arranged by landlords. Where male nobles returned from disguise with policy reforms, Araka brought something radical: the realization that women's autonomy wasn't just a noble privilege but a human right. The stakes grew deadlier when noblewomen crossed not just class lines but battle lines. During the 100 Years' War, Yolande of Aragon allegedly disguised herself as a wool trader to enter English-occupied territories, gathering intelligence while selling fabric to garrison commanders. One slip, a too-polished accent, an unearned callous would have meant execution as a spy. Yet her success reshaped the war's course. Intelligence she gathered led to the liberation of key fortresses, all while male chroniclers attributed the victories to her male relatives. Even in disguise, women's contributions were often cloaked twice, first in peasant garb, then in historical omission. Perhaps the most poignant stories come from those who never reclaimed their titles. In the alpine villages of Switzerland, folk songs still tell of the Lady of the Goats, a noblewoman who abandoned her castle after witnessing her husband's soldiers brutalize villagers. For decades, she tended flocks under a new name, midwifing babies and teaching children to read until her true identity was revealed at her funeral. By then, no one cared. Her epitaph, carved by local shepherds, reads simply, "She chose us." These women's legacies whisper a truth louder than any proclamation. When privilege becomes a cage, sometimes the bravest act isn't ruling differently, it's refusing to rule at all. Silk and spices, ledgers and trade routes, these were the tools of merchants, but also the perfect cover for nobles who needed to move unseen. While peasant disguises revealed harsh truths about poverty, merchant personas offered something equally valuable: invisibility among the bustling middle class. A lord in rags might draw pity or suspicion, but a well-dressed trader with a caravan of goods, that was someone everyone ignored. And in the cutthroat world of medieval politics, that anonymity could mean the difference between survival and a knife in the dark. Take the case of Cosimo de' Medici, the cunning Florentine banker who essentially ruled Renaissance Italy from behind a merchant's counter. His family's wealth came from trade, but their power came from secrets gathered by Cosimo himself as he traveled Europe posing as a wool merchant. While rivals dismissed him as a mere moneylender, he used his cover to forge alliances in plain sight, securing papal contracts and military loans that would later topple his enemies. His greatest trick, convincing everyone that his political maneuvers were just business deals. But merchant disguises weren't just for gathering power, they could also save lives. During the War of the Roses, Margaret of Anjou, the fiercely loyal Queen of England's Henry VI, disguised herself and her young son as cloth traders to escape enemy forces after a crushing defeat. Dressed in the unremarkable garb of a Flemish merchant's family, they slipped through checkpoints where armored knights would have been stopped instantly. Margaret's success hinged on a simple truth: merchants crossed borders constantly, their comings and goings barely noted. For nobles hunted by their enemies, that mundane predictability was a lifeline. Some rulers took the merchant's mask even further, turning trade itself into a weapon. In the 1500s, the Ottoman prince Sem Sultan escaped assassination by fleeing to Rhodes, not as a royal exile but as a gem dealer. His disguise allowed him to negotiate with the Knights Hospitaller for sanctuary, all while his brother's spies scoured ports for a fugitive prince. What his enemies missed was right in front of them. The quiet man haggling over rubies in the marketplace was the very prize they sought. Perhaps the most brilliant use of this tactic came from Venice, where the Doge spies operated under the perfect cover, the city's legendary merchant guilds. These agents didn't just pretend to be traders, they became them, running actual businesses that funneled intelligence back to the palace. A spice shipment from Alexandria might carry coded reports about Mamluk troop movements. A banker's loan to a French noble could reveal alliances forming against Venice. The genius lay in the duality. Every transaction served both profit and politics, leaving enemies unable to distinguish commerce from conspiracy. What separated these merchant disguises from peasant ruses was their subtlety. A noble tilling fields had to mimic backbreaking labor, but playing a merchant required mastering something far trickier, the art of being unremarkably competent. Too poor and you'd stand out as a failed trader, too rich and you might as well wear a crown. The sweet spot was in the middle, a persona prosperous enough to command respect, but ordinary enough to avoid scrutiny. And in that space between obscurity and influence, disguised nobles found the freedom to rewrite destinies, one business trip at a time. On the surface, the Feast of Fools seemed like just another medieval festival, a day of wine, masks, and mischief where social hierarchies briefly flip. Peasants donned tattered cloaks trimmed with fake ermine, play acting as kings, while nobles smeared dirt on their faces and pretended to till fields. But beneath the laughter and ale-soaked revelry, something far more subversive was at work. For a few precious hours each year, the rigid walls of class crumbled, and people glimpsed what the world might look like if power wasn't inherited but performed. Take the case of the annual Abbot of Unreason celebrations in Scotland, where a peasant was crowned mock ruler for the day, issuing absurd decrees that thinly veiled real grievances. One year, a decree demanded all nobles share their feasts with the hungry, a joke that lingered uncomfortably in the air when local lords realized their subjects weren't entirely laughing. In France, the Festival of the Donkey saw a miller's daughter dressed as a queen, presiding over a parody court where villagers tried their landlords for imaginary crimes. The humor was sharp enough to draw blood, especially when real tax collectors found themselves booed off makeshift stages. But sometimes the line between farce and fury vanished entirely. In 1520 Basel, a group of weavers turned their Fool's Day costumes into something darker. Instead of the usual bawdy songs, they staged a mock trial accusing the city's elite of hoarding grain during a famine. At first, the crowd chuckled until the actors began reading actual names and prices from ledgers they'd secretly obtained. The festival ended in riots, with revelers burning effigies of merchants who'd profited from starvation. What began as play had become a people's tribunal, proving that even temporary role reversals could crack open Pandora's box. The most striking transformations, though, happened not to the peasants, but to the nobles who played along. In Flanders, records tell of a count who joined the festivities as a blacksmith, only to spend the next week quietly investigating why real smiths couldn't afford their own tools. His subsequent crackdown on price-gouging ironmongers began with a throwaway festival joke. How does a man shoe horses when the nails cost more than the horse? For every 10 nobles who dismissed such events as silly tradition, one found themselves rattled by the experience of being ignored, jostled, or mocked while in disguise. Perhaps that's why these festivals were both cherished and feared. They were pressure valves for discontent, yes, but also mirrors held up to a society's deepest fractures. When a duke, dressed as a beggar for a day, returned to his castle with bread tossed at his feet instead of gold, it wasn't just his pride that stung. It was the realization that his subjects saw him not as a protector, but as another mouth to feed. and when the masks came off, some rulers couldn't unsee what they'd witnessed. The Feast of Fools might have lasted only a day, but the fools, it turned out, were often the ones who never questioned their place at the top. Not every noble who traded their finery for rags did so out of empathy or strategy. Some wore peasant disguises as masks of shame, their only refuge from the consequences of their own crimes. Take the infamous case of Sir Godfrey of Millau, a 14th-century French knight who terrorized the countryside under the pretense of collecting taxes for his liege lord. When villagers discovered he'd been pocketing the money and fabricating the levies, a warrant was issued for his arrest. But rather than face execution, Godfrey vanished into the forests of Languedoc, reappearing months later as a charcoal burner named Pierre. For years, he lived in a smoke-blackened hut, his sword buried beneath the hearth, his once proud face obscured by soot. His downfall came not from any moral awakening, but from sheer habit. He couldn't resist cheating his fellow charcoal sellers, and when they dragged him before a magistrate for theft, his nobleman's scars gave him away. The trial records note the irony. A man who'd stolen fortunes was finally caught stealing bread. Then there was the even more brazen case of Lady Margaret von Hohenberg, an Austrian noblewoman who faked her own death to escape punishment for poisoning her husband. While her family mourned an empty coffin, she slipped across the border into Bavaria, dyeing her hair black and taking work as a dairymaid. Her disguise was nearly perfect until a visiting bishop recognized her distinctive ring, a family heirloom she'd been too sentimental to sell. What made her story unforgettable wasn't just the crime, but the reaction of the peasants who'd sheltered her. They'd known her as Greta the Kind, a woman who'd shared her wages with sick children. When the truth emerged, the village nearly rioted to protect her, forcing authorities to smuggle her out in a wagon under cover of night. Even in disgrace, her time among the poor had rewritten her legacy. But perhaps no fallen noble exploited peasant anonymity more ruthlessly than Boris, the Wolf of Novgorod. A tax collector notorious for his cruelty, Boris fled into the Russian wilderness after being accused of murdering a merchant who dared to complain to the Tsar. For a decade, he lived as a hermit trapper, his identity shielded by the vastness of the taiga. His capture came not through any slip, but through an act of poetic justice. He was recognized by one of his former victims, a man whose fingers Boris had ordered severed for tax evasion, now working as a fur trader. The mutilated man didn't turn Boris in immediately. Instead, he spent weeks earning the outlaw's trust, only to lead him straight into a trap at the next trading post. Chronicles say Boris screamed not when they bound him, but when they stripped off his patched coat to reveal the silk shirt he'd stubbornly worn beneath it all those years. These stories reveal a darker side to noble disguises. For every ruler seeking enlightenment, there was a fugitive exploiting the poor's invisibility. Yet even their tales carried unexpected lessons. Sir Godfrey's charcoal-burning neighbors testified at his trial, not about his crimes as a knight, but about how he'd taught their children to read by firelight. Lady Margaret's dairy co-workers smuggled letters to her prison cell, addressed to Greta long after her title was revoked, and Boris, his severed-fingered captor, insisted he be tried under his peasant alias, declaring, "Let the wolf die a noble." Let Boris the trapper be remembered as innocent. In the end, the disguises they'd worn to hide became the masks that haunted them, forcing even the worst of the elite to confront the humanity of those they'd once considered beneath notice. The monastery's heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, sealing away his old life as effectively as if he'd stepped into another world. For a nobleman fleeing political ruin or seeking spiritual renewal, the monk's robe offered something no other disguise could: instant anonymity wrapped in sacred protection. To wear the habit was to become invisible not just to enemies but to history itself. When Duke Henry of Bavaria disguised himself as a Benedictine novice after losing his lands in the 1200s, chroniclers noted how seamlessly he vanished into the rhythm of prayer and labor. His hands, once gloved in silk for court ceremonies, now blistered from scrubbing monastery floors. His voice, accustomed to commanding armies, blended into the chant of psalms. And when his enemies came searching, they passed right by the humble brother copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, never guessing those ink-stained fingers had once signed death warrants. Religious orders became sanctuaries for fallen nobles precisely because they were the one place where earthly status meant nothing. A king kneeling in penance looked no different from a farmer seeking absolution. This sacred leveling allowed figures like King Eric of Denmark to escape assassination by hiding among Franciscan friars, his royal beard shaved to stubble, his crown swapped for a simple tonsure. For Eric, the disguise wasn't just physical, it reshaped his reign. When he eventually reclaimed his throne, he did so with reforms inspired by the friars' teachings, abolishing harsh laws against the poor. His time in the monastery hadn't just saved his life, it had given him a new language of power, one rooted in mercy rather than might. Pilgrimage offered another sacred camouflage, its very purpose designed to strip away worldly identities. Princess Theodora of Byzantium exploited this when she fled a forced marriage by joining a band of pilgrims heading to Jerusalem. Dressed in the plain wool gown of a penitent, her face obscured by a traveler's hood, she moved undetected through lands where her portrait adorned coins. But the genius of her disguise lay in its authenticity. She didn't just play a pilgrim, she became one, walking every mile barefoot and surviving on alms. By the time she reached sanctuary in a convent, the blisters on her feet had erased not just her privilege, but her desire to reclaim it. Years later, when diplomats tracked her down to offer her father's throne, she reportedly showed them her calloused hands and asked, "Does this look like the skin of an empress?" Yet not all sacred disguises were born of desperation. Some nobles sought them out as acts of defiance. When Elena of Castile's brother confiscated her estates, she didn't just retire to a nunnery, she turned her exile into theater. Arriving at the convent in a bridal gown symbolizing her marriage to Christ, she staged her entrance as a grand spectacle, forcing the church to acknowledge her as a noble bride rather than a disgraced sister. Her carefully crafted piety became political armor, shielding her from further attacks while rallying public sympathy. Behind the convent walls, she continued ruling through coded letters, proving that a wimple could hide as much as a helmet. The most profound transformations, though, happened to those who never shed their holy disguises. Take the case of Count Ulrich of Württemberg, who entered a monastery after a battlefield massacre left him haunted. What began as a temporary refuge became his life's work. He took permanent vows, using his military training to organize flood defenses for nearby villages. Locals called him Brother Shield, unaware he'd once led cavalry charges. When he died decades later, his tomb bore no heraldry, just the epitaph he'd chosen, a sinner who tried. His story, like so many others, reveals the dual power of religious disguise. It could be a cloak for survival, yes, but also a mirror, forcing the privileged to confront who they were beneath the trappings of power. And for some, that reflection was too humbling to ever look away from. Among the nobles who walked incognito through villages and towns, a rare few carried more than just curiosity. They carried messages that would shake the foundations of their world. These weren't mere observers, they became firebrands and reformers, using their disguises as pulpits to preach ideas too dangerous to voice at court. Stripped of their titles, they discovered something startling. Anonymity didn't just reveal truth, it gave them the freedom to speak it. Consider the case of Lord Aldrich of Burgundy, a minor noble who vanished from court in the 1400s. only to reappear months later as a wandering preacher known as Brother Martin. His sermons, delivered in muddy market squares, condemned the church's corruption with such precision that locals swore he must have insider knowledge. He spoke of gold-laden bishops while peasants starved, of pardons sold like cabbages, all themes that mirrored the grievances of his own family's private correspondence. But without his title, his words carried none of the weight of a noble's complaint. Instead, they rang with the raw authority of a man who'd supposedly lived among the poor. By the time authorities unmasked him, his teachings had already sparked tax revolts across the region. At his trial, Aldrich didn't deny his identity. He simply smiled and said, "You'll hang a lord today, but the voice of Martin will still be out there because it was never mine to begin with." Then there was the even more mysterious figure known only as the Weaver of Lyon, a woman whose fiery speeches about equality drew crowds in 15th century France. Dressed in the rough-spun garb of a textile worker, she preached that nobility wasn't inherited but earned through compassion. What her listeners never guessed was that she was actually Isabelle de Valois, the disinherited daughter of a duke. Her disguise allowed her to say the unthinkable, that serfdom was a sin, that no soul was born to serve, ideas that would have gotten her branded a heretic if spoken in her father's halls. When challenged about her knowledge of courtly life, she'd laugh and say, "Do you think angels whisper only to kings?" By the time the Inquisition identified her, she'd vanished again, leaving behind a network of study groups that would later fuel peasant revolts. The most profound impact, however, came from those who blended spirituality with social critique. In 16th century Germany, a ragged, mendicant monk began appearing in villages ravaged by noble feuds, offering not just alms but startlingly specific advice on resisting unjust taxes. His sermons quoted obscure legal codes knowledge far beyond most clergy, let alone beggars. Only decades later did records reveal his true identity, a disgraced knight named Jurgen von Hohenheim who'd studied law before losing his land. His disguise let him weaponize his education for those who needed it most, teaching peasants how to document abuses and appeal directly to imperial courts. Where armored revolts failed, his parchments and petitions won concessions. His legacy wasn't rebellion, it was literacy as liberation. What made these figures so dangerous to the established order wasn't just their ideas, but how they delivered them. A noble preaching reform from a throne would be ignored or overthrown. But a peasant speaking truths too raw to ignore, that voice carried the weight of lived experience even when it was borrowed. And in that paradox lay their power. They could say what no aristocrat dared, while their listeners never suspected they were learning to think like one. The greatest disguise wasn't the clothes, it was making the privileged sound like the oppressed, until the oppressed began demanding the privileges of justice. In the shadowy corridors of medieval power, the most dangerous place for a child wasn't a battlefield or a plague-ridden village, it was a royal nursery. Heirs to thrones faced threats from the moment they drew breath. Jealous uncles rivaled dynasties, even their own regents who might prefer a puppet to a true successor. So some nobles made an unthinkable choice. They smuggled their children out of castles and into peasant cradles, trading silken swaddling for rough-spun blankets. These secret heirs didn't just survive in hiding, they grew up with skills no palace education could provide, returning to claim their birthrights with perspectives that reshaped kingdoms. Take the astonishing case of Prince Casimir of Poland, whisked away as an infant during a coup in the 1400s. Raised by a forester's family under the name Kazakh, he learned to track deer through snow and barter at village markets, skills that seemed useless for a future king. But when he was finally restored to the throne at 16, that very upbringing became his strength. While other nobles relied on questionable tax reports, Casimir personally inspected ledgers, spotting discrepancies courtiers assumed he'd missed. When advisors warned against reducing grain tariffs, he recounted winters when his foster family had traded their only cow for a sack of flour. His reign became legendary for economic reforms that lifted peasant burdens, all because he'd lived the consequences of every royal decree. Then there's the bittersweet tale of Lady Johanna of Flanders, whose parents hid her among wool weavers after her brothers were poisoned. For 18 years, she believed herself the daughter of a loom master, mastering textile patterns that later dazzled diplomats. When her identity was revealed, the very nobles who should have welcomed her instead mocked her common speech and calloused hands until she outmaneuvered them all. Using the complex guild hierarchies she'd learned in the workshops, she reorganized her court's patronage system, breaking noble monopolies by directly supporting artisan allies. Her enemies had expected an ignorant peasant girl. They got a ruler who understood power from the spindle up, but not all hidden heirs returned as benevolent reformers. In 15th century Transylvania, Voivode Vladislav III was raised by shepherds after his family's massacre, an experience that left him fluent in the brutal pragmatism of mountain life. When he reclaimed his throne, he governed not with courtly grace, but with a shepherd's ruthlessness. Tax collectors who skimmed coins found themselves dangling from the very cliffs where young Vladislav had chased stray lambs. His reign became a byword for terror, proving that survival in hardship didn't always breed mercy. Sometimes it bred a wolf in king's clothing. The cruelest twist came when the disguise became irreversible. In 1384 Scotland, the infant heir to the Douglas clan was hidden with a fisherman's family during an English invasion. But when rescuers finally came, they found the boy had drowned in a storm. His foster father, unaware of the child's true worth, had taken him on a routine catch. The clan's subsequent collapse revealed the fragile irony of these arrangements. You could dress an heir in rags, but you couldn't erase the value that made them a target. What united these stories wasn't just secrecy. It was the indelible mark left by lives lived in two worlds. These children absorbed peasant rhythms like mother's milk, the way a cooper's daughter knew which villages would pay extra for watertight barrels, or how a blacksmith's foster son understood which metals held an edge. When they eventually stepped into power, they didn't just rule over commoners, they remembered being them. And in that memory lay both their greatest strength and their most unsettling truth, that the difference between a prince and a pauper was often just the luck of where you were born. Love in the Middle Ages was never simple, but when nobility and commoners fell for each other, the stakes soared, especially when one didn't know the other's true station. Picture a troubadour strumming lute strings beneath a castle window, his ballads so tender they move the lady listening above. But twist the tale, the troubadour isn't some wandering minstrel, he's a duke in disguise, testing whether her affection is genuine or just another gold-digging scheme. These weren't just romantic fantasies scribbled in illuminated manuscripts. They were real, risky games of the heart where a single slip could unravel lives. Take the infamous case of Sir Alaric of Provence, a knight who disguised himself as a stable hand to court a wool merchant's daughter named Elise. For months, he mucked stalls by day and whispered poetry to her by night, his calloused hands and straw-strewn hair selling the lie. When Elise's father arranged her marriage to a wealthy but cruel clothier, Alaric revealed his identity, offering her a choice: life as a nobleman's wife or a merchant's prisoner. What made their story legendary wasn't the grand reveal, it was Elise's response. She refused him, declaring she'd fallen for the stable boy's kindness, not the knight's title. Only after Alaric sold his lands and returned to her as a commoner did she relent. proving love could bridge class divides, but only if both sides were willing to burn the bridge behind them. Then there were the noblewomen who played this dangerous game. In 12th century Aquitaine, Lady Sibyl disguised herself as a scribe's apprentice to observe the artist painting her chapel's frescoes. What began as curiosity about his techniques turned to fascination with the way his hands brought beauty from plain plaster. When their secret trysts were discovered, her family had the artist's fingers broken until Sibyl threatened to publicly renounce her title. The compromise: the artist was knighted overnight, his talent rebranded as noble genius rather than common labor. Their marriage was tense but enduring, with Sibyl's journals confessing she missed the freedom of being just a girl with a charcoal stub, not a lady with a dowry. But not all disguises ended in compromise. In Bohemia, a blacksmith's son named Tomas fell for a veiled widow who visited his forge weekly, always slipping coins into his palm without meeting his eyes. When he finally glimpsed her face, recognizing the exiled Queen Johanna, hiding from political enemies, he kept her secret, even as their love deepened. Their undoing came from an unexpected source: Tomas's own father, who betrayed Johanna to authorities, fearing his son's association with her would doom their family. The heartbreak here wasn't just romantic, it was systemic. No matter how genuine the love, some class barriers were policed not just by nobles, but by commoners terrified of upsetting the fragile order. The cruelest twists came when the disguise itself became the poison. In one Lombard chronicle, a merchant's daughter named Livia fell for a drunken guardsman who serenaded her with off-key ballads. Only after eloping did she discover he was actually Count Orsino, testing her ability to love beneath her station. The punchline: he abandoned her within a year, bored by her common manners. Her revenge was poetic. She used the literacy he'd mocked to pen a scathing account of his cruelty, which circulated so widely it ruined his marriage prospects. The manuscript's title, How a Count Played Peasant and Proved Himself the Real Fool. These tangled tales reveal a truth sharper than any dagger. In a world where birth dictated destiny, love was the one force that could sometimes rewrite the rules. But the price was steep. For every couple who found happiness, others faced exile, violence, or the crushing realization that their passion couldn't survive the weight of reality. Yet even the failures left their mark. When nobles returned to their castles after these escapades, they carried back more than just memories. They carried the unsettling knowledge that the hearts of commoners beat just as fiercely as their own, and that no amount of silk could armor them against that truth. History remembers kings and queens, but sometimes the most influential voices belonged to those who never revealed their true names. Among the peasant revolts and village councils of medieval Europe, a curious figure occasionally emerged: a humble farmer or craftsman whose wisdom seemed too sharp, whose strategies too polished for someone of their station. These were the secret nobles, men and women who rose to leadership among commoners while guarding their birthright like a hidden dagger. Their double lives forced a haunting question: can advice carry more weight when the advisor has nothing to gain, or when they're the ultimate insider hiding in plain sight? Take the case of Martin the Miller, a man who organized resistance against unfair grain taxes in 14th century Flanders. His speeches in village squares dissected feudal law with startling precision, and his petitions to the count were drafted in handwriting suspiciously like a clerk's. When authorities finally grew suspicious, they uncovered the truth. Martin was actually Sir Gautier de Flanders, a disgraced knight stripped of lands after opposing the Count's war policies. But here's the twist the peasants already knew. Old tax records show they'd been slipping coins to his former squire for years to keep his secret. Why follow a fallen noble? As one villager later confessed, A lord who chooses to stand with us in the dirt has more honor than one who watches from a tower. Then there was the even more audacious story of Sister Agnes, a nun who became spiritual advisor to Queen Joanna of Naples in the 1300s. Her uncanny grasp of court politics and fluent Latin raised eyebrows, but it was her violent opposition to the Queen's proposed marriage that revealed her past. Intercepted letters proved Agnes was actually Maria of Calabria, Joanna's own aunt, who'd faked her death to escape political imprisonment. For 5 years, she shaped Naples' policies from a cloister's shadows, using her peasant disguise not to hide from power, but to wield it differently. When confronted, she reportedly told her niece, "You listened to a nun's counsel, but never your aunt's. What does that tell you about who wears the real mask?" These dual lives exposed a delicious irony of medieval society. Sometimes, the only way for nobility to be heard was to stop being noble. When Duke W. Ladislaw of Poland wanted to reform oppressive hunting laws, he knew his nobles would ignore him, so he posed as a gamekeeper named Jan, joining poachers to document abuses. His resulting reforms were wildly popular precisely because they appeared to come from peasant demands, not royal decree. The Duke's journal later confessed the lesson: "A crown makes men bow, but a shared secret makes them listen." Yet the most profound impact came from those who never revealed themselves at all. In the Swiss Alps, a traveling tinsmith known as Pietro the Silent mediated village disputes for decades with judgments so fair, neighboring towns paid to bring him their cases. Only after his death did a faded tattoo on his shoulder, a noble family's crest, suggest why he'd always refused to remove his shirt. No one ever learned his true name, but his legacy lived on in the tinsmith's code, a set of arbitration rules still used in some alpine communities today. His story begs the question we're still wrestling with centuries later. Does it matter who dispenses wisdom, so long as the wisdom itself is sound? Or does every masked truth, no matter how well-intentioned, carry the ghost of deception in its bones? Warfare in the Middle Ages wasn't just about swords and siege engines. It was a psychological chess match where deception could mean the difference between victory and slaughter. Some of history's most brilliant commanders understood this intimately, trading their gilded armor for the grimy tunics of foot soldiers to walk unnoticed among their enemies. Picture a king, his face smeared with dirt, standing shoulder to shoulder with peasants in the shield wall, listening as men cursed his own orders or revealed weaknesses in their formation. These weren't acts of reckless bravery. They were calculated gambits where the stakes were nothing less than kingdoms. During the siege of Antioch in the First Crusade, Bohemond of Taranto pulled off one of the most audacious disguises in military history. With his forces starving and outnumbered, he dressed as a Syrian merchant and slipped through enemy lines, counting supply wagons and noting where the Seljuk sentries changed shifts. The intelligence he gathered revealed a critical gap in their defenses, a section of wall guarded by inexperienced troops who napped at dawn. When Bohemond's knights attacked that weak point days later, they found the gate unbarred, turning certain defeat into a legendary victory. What made this ruse so effective wasn't just the information he stole, but the psychological blow it dealt. The Seljuks had been so certain of their superiority that the idea of a Frankish prince walking among them never crossed their minds. But scouting wasn't the only reason for these dangerous masquerades. Some commanders used them to test their own army's morale. At the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, Polish King W. Ladislaw Jagiello allegedly disguised himself as a standard-bearer to move through his multinational forces before the clash with the Teutonic Knights. What he heard in those tense hours, Lithuanian mercenaries doubting their pay would come. Czech archers complaining about soggy bowstrings allowed him to address grievances before they became mutiny. When the fighting began, his troops held the line against devastating cavalry charges, partly because their unseen king had already eased the tensions threatening to fracture his army. The risks of these disguises were terrifyingly real. At Agincourt, French chronicles tell of the Duke of Alençon disguising himself as an English longbowman to study Henry V's defenses. His flawless English and stolen surcoat almost worked until a veteran archer noticed his expensive riding boots peeking beneath the disguise. The Duke barely escaped with his life, leaving behind 2 fingers to an English broadsword as a permanent reminder that peasant clothes couldn't hide noble habits. Perhaps the most poignant wartime disguises were those meant to inspire rather than deceive. During the Reconquista, Castilian noblewoman Maria de Padilla famously dressed as a common soldier to fight alongside her husband's troops when they stormed Muslim-held Seville. Though her identity was an open secret among the men, the symbolism was electric. A highborn lady willing to share their dangers erased the distance between commanders and infantry. Years later, veterans would still swear they saw her banner flickering in the thickest fighting, though official records placed her miles away. Such legends reveal the true power of these disguises. They transformed strategic necessity into something mythic, proving that in war, the most potent weapon wasn't always a sword. Sometimes it was the willingness to disappear. In the flickering torchlight of the medieval hall, where nobles flinched at every whispered conspiracy, one figure danced through the tension untouched: the court jester. With his motley cap and jingling bells, he could mock kings to their faces and walk away laughing. But what if those barbs weren't just the ramblings of a fool? What if the jester's grin hid a noble's calculating gaze? Some of history's sharpest critiques of power came from jesters who weren't fools at all, but aristocrats in disguise, using humor as a Trojan horse for truth. Take the infamous case of Patch, the beloved fool of England's Henry VIII. Chronicles note his uncanny knowledge of court intrigues until a drunken nobleman ripped off his wig during a performance, revealing the scarred face of Baron Thomas Cromwell's disgraced nephew. For years, Patch had been skewering Henry's marital misadventures with jokes no commoner could have crafted, like comparing the king's 6 wives to a man who keeps buying new boots but won't admit his feet are the problem. The Baron's nephew wasn't just entertaining, he was airing family grievances with the safety of a fool's license. His eventual pardon suggests Henry knew the value of truth wrapped in laughter, even if it came from an enemy. Then there was the even bolder deception of Gratian, the dwarf jester at the Burgundian court. His biting parodies of Duke Philip the Good's military failures were so precise, they included tactical details only seasoned commanders would recognize. When challenged, Gratian claimed he'd learned strategy from sparrows fighting over crumbs. The ruse held until a visiting count recognized the dwarf's hands, unblemished by labor, with the distinctive ring scar of a knight's gauntlet. The man turned out to be Jacques de Lalaing, a disinherited knight seeking revenge through ridicule. His most daring stunt, staging a mock tournament where doll-sized knights carried banners reading, "Our Duke's Ambitions," each embroidered with the names of real villages lost in Philip's wars. The Duke reportedly laughed until he saw the casualty lists hidden in the doll's armor, then quietly reinstated de Lalaing's lands. But the most subversive jesters weren't always seeking personal gain. In 15th century Aragon, a woman known only as La Sabia, the wise fool, performed riddles that exposed clerical corruption. Her punchlines quoted canon law verbatim, impossible for an illiterate entertainer. When the archbishop demanded her arrest, Queen Maria intervened, whispering something that made him pale. Rumors swirled that La Sabia was actually the queen's exiled aunt, a nun who'd fled a corrupt convent. Her true identity vanished from records, but her foolish critiques became the basis for church reforms years later. The genius of these disguised nobles wasn't just in their wit, it was in their understanding of power's paradox. A king could silence a critic, but punishing a jester risked looking thin-skinned. By wrapping their truths in absurdity, they exploited the one vulnerability no armor could shield: a ruler's fear of being laughed at. Their legacy lingers in every political cartoon and satirical show today, proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword, it's a punchline delivered by someone who knows exactly where it'll hurt. The fiery rhetoric of peasant revolts often echoed with an unexpected refinement, phrases too polished, strategies too sophisticated for men who'd spent lifetimes behind plows. That's because some uprisings weren't as grassroots as they seemed. Hidden among the torch-wielding crowds were nobles who traded their titles for rags, steering rebellions for motives as tangled as the roots of the injustice they fought. Some sought to exploit the chaos for power, others genuinely believed in the cause, but all of them played with fire, discovering too late that revolutions are easier to start than control. Take the bloody revolt of 1381 in England, where chroniclers noted a shadowy figure known only as John the Lawyer, drafting the rebels' demands. His petitions cited obscure feudal statutes and even quoted Latin legal maxims, knowledge far beyond the reach of illiterate farmhands. Years later, pardoned rebels confessed their leader was actually Sir Roger Clarendon, an illegitimate son of the Black Prince. Disinherited and embittered, he'd used the uprising as revenge against the crown that denied him. Yet his legacy was paradoxical. Though Clarendon abandoned the rebels when the tide turned, the statutes he helped draft became the blueprint for later labor reforms. The rebellion failed, but the ideas he planted outlived him. Then there was the even murkier case of the Shepherd King, who led the 1323 Flemish uprising. Peasants whispered he fought with the precision of a trained knight, his sword strokes too clean for a man who'd never held a blade. When authorities finally captured him, they peeled back his filthy tunic to reveal the telltale scars of aristocratic combat training. The shock: he wasn't some disgraced lord, but the younger brother of the reigning count, a man named Willem who'd secretly joined the revolt to undermine his siblings' rule. His plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of toppling his brother, the revolt unified the nobility against the rebels, and Willem died on the same gallows as the peasants he'd pretended to champion. But not all disguised nobles were cynics. In the Alpine valleys of Austria, the 1525 Peasants' War featured a mysterious strategist called Brother Marcus, who taught farmers to fortify mountain passes using techniques straight from imperial military manuals. When rebels stormed a bishop's castle, Marcus ordered the wine cellars locked and the granaries distributed, a discipline unheard of in typical uprisings. After the rebellion collapsed, a jailed monk confessed Marcus was actually Ulrich von Habsburg, a minor noble who'd studied under reformist theologians. Unlike Clarendon or Willem, Ulrich never sought power. He'd burned his own estate records before joining the rebels, freeing his serfs in an act that convinced even skeptical peasants of his sincerity. His severed head, displayed alongside rebel leaders, became a grim symbol of how deeply class betrayal unnerved the elite. The cruelest twist: these nobles often underestimated the people they sought to lead or manipulate. In Hungary's 1413 Dózsa rebellion, a knight disguised as a blacksmith named István tried channeling peasant rage against his political rivals. But when rebels discovered his true identity, they didn't hail him as an ally, they branded him a spy and burned him alive in his own armor. The lesson was brutal but clear. Revolutions have a way of consuming those who play at being revolutionaries. What makes these stories so haunting isn't just the disguises, but the collisions of idealism and ambition they reveal. Some nobles saw peasants as pawns, others saw them as partners. But in the end, the rebellions they joined, whether for selfish or selfless reasons, left marks deeper than any of them imagined. Because when a man who's worn a crown pretends to share the burdens of those who have never tasted power, he doesn't just change the revolt. He changes himself, and sometimes against all odds, he changes history. Imagine a royal messenger, his cloak embroidered with the crest of his king, riding openly across borders to deliver terms of peace. Now picture the exact opposite, a nobleman disguised as a wine merchant, haggling over casks in a crowded market while secretly negotiating the fate of nations. That was the reality of medieval covert diplomacy, where the most delicate political deals often happened in shadow rather than sunlight. For rulers who needed to test alliances or broker ceasefires without tipping their hand, sending an incognito envoy wasn't just clever, it was the only way to speak frankly without triggering immediate war. Take the case of Duke Philip the Bold of Burgundy, who dressed as a wool trader to meet with English agents during the 100 Years' War. His disguise wasn't just about anonymity, it was about plausible deniability. If the talks failed, his official court could claim ignorance, avoiding the humiliation of a rejected proposal. But when the English side unexpectedly demanded proof of his identity, Philip faced a dilemma. Reveal himself and risk exposure of the entire mission, or maintain the ruse and forfeit credibility. His solution was pure medieval cunning. He slipped a signet ring into a loaf of bread, letting his counterpart discover it accidentally. The talks succeeded, proving that sometimes the most effective diplomacy required a magician's flair for misdirection. Then there were the risks of being too convincing. In 1423, Castilian nobleman Alvaro de Luna infiltrated Moorish Granada as a blind minstrel to discuss a secret truce. His performance was so authentic, right down to the milky cataracts painted over his eyes, that when he finally revealed his identity to the emir's vizier, the man refused to believe him. The resulting confusion nearly derailed the talks until Alvaro resorted to reciting the lineage of Granada's rulers flawlessly, knowledge no wandering musician could possess. His mission secured a decade of peace, but the lesson was clear. A disguise could be too good, erasing the very authority it was meant to shield. The stakes soared when women undertook these covert missions. Marguerite of Anjou, the formidable queen consort of England's Henry VI, often sent her ladies-in-waiting disguised as pilgrims or merchants to carry messages to rebel factions. Their flowing veils and pious demeanors made them practically invisible in an era when noblewomen rarely traveled unescorted. But the most audacious female diplomat might have been Caterina Sforza, who smuggled herself into a rival's fortress inside a rolled-up tapestry to negotiate her son's release. When the guards unfurled the fabric, they found not a noblewoman in silks, but a hardened negotiator in servant's garb, dagger strapped to her thigh. Her terms, "Free my boy, or I'll ensure this tapestry becomes your shroud." The boy was released by dawn, yet not all secret missions ended in triumph. In 15th century Lithuania, Duke Vytautas sent his chancellor to Moscow disguised as a fur trader, only for the man to be recognized by a former prisoner who'd seen him at court. The resulting uproar shattered months of delicate negotiations, sparking a border war that lasted years. The Duke's fatal miscalculation, assuming that in the vastness of the Russian winter, one more fur-clad merchant would go unnoticed. But in diplomacy, as in warfare, the smallest slip could unravel everything. What made these disguised diplomats so fascinating wasn't just their bravery, it was their understanding of power's theater. They knew that sometimes the most binding treaties weren't signed in gilded halls, but in candlelit back rooms by people who officially didn't exist. And in a world where the wrong word could mobilize armies, anonymity wasn't just an advantage, it was the only safe space where truth could be spoken. History books love kings and battles, but the real pulse of medieval life often beat in places chroniclers rarely visited: the smoky hearths of peasant cottages, the gossip-filled stalls of village markets. That's why some nobles did something radical. They put down their swords, picked up quills, and vanished into the crowds to record the world as their subjects experienced it. These undercover scribes didn't just observe, they documented hunger, corruption, and resilience with a level of detail no court historian would dare include. And in doing so, they preserved voices that history had tried to erase. Consider the astonishing case of the Monk of Montauban, a French nobleman who spent the 1200s disguised as a traveling cleric, compiling what scholars now call the secret ledger. Unlike official records that tallied crops and taxes, his parchment pages overflowed with the human cost behind those numbers: mothers bartering daughters to pay grain debts, blacksmiths forging fake coins to survive winter, old soldiers begging at crossroads with wounds no one bothered to bind. The ledger's most chilling entry, a marginal note estimating that for every 10 peasants born, 3 would starve before turning 30, a statistic no lord's account book would ever admit. Then there was Lady Beatrice of Navarre, who posed as a scribe for a merchant guild to record the lives of working women. Her book of unseen hands detailed how female brewers circumvented laws barring them from selling ale. They called it liquid bread to exploit a loophole, or how midwives kept secret registers of noblemen's illegitimate children as insurance against persecution. When Beatrice's identity was discovered, her own family burned most copies, but one survived hidden in a loom, proving that some truths were too stubborn to vanish. The most subversive chroniclers didn't just document suffering, they weaponized it. In 14th century Germany, a knight calling himself Brother Barnabas infiltrated serf villages, then published the Mirror of Lords, a scathing comparison of feudal laws with biblical commandments. His work juxtaposed verses about feeding the hungry with landlord policies that confiscated seed grain, or Christ's forgiveness with bailiffs who tortured debtors. Distributed anonymously, the book became so dangerous that authorities ordered every copy seized, only to find peasants had memorized entire passages to recite at clandestine gatherings. What makes these hidden chronicles so revolutionary isn't just their content, but their perspective. Official histories described peasant revolts as mindless riots. The disguised nobles' accounts revealed meticulous planning, how rebels used church bells as signals, or timed uprisings to coincide with tax collections when garrisons were undermanned. Where court scribes wrote of noble charity, these undercover observers recorded the exact number of moldy loaves tossed to beggars after banquets where 20 courses went uneaten. The irony, many of these truth-tellers were eventually unmasked not by angry mobs, but by their own handwriting. A duke's daughter might fake a commoner's accent, but her elegant script gave her away when she forgot to mimic the shaky letters of someone who'd never held a quill. Yet even their failures left a legacy. When the abbot of Cluny found one such chronicle hidden in his monastery's walls, he didn't burn it. He added his own corrections in the margins, confessing which injustices he'd witnessed but never stopped. That's the real power of these disguised voices. They didn't just expose lies, they made silence itself feel like complicity. The moment a noble's disguise slipped, the reaction could mean life or death, not based on the act itself, but on who caught them and why. In 1346 France, Count Henry de Bourbon was discovered disguised as a salt smuggler, while investigating corruption in his own tax offices. The local magistrate, unaware of his identity, sentenced him to hang until Henry revealed a signet ring hidden in his boot. Instead of facing the noose, he walked away with apologies, while the corrupt officials he'd exposed swung in his place. Yet a century later, Duke Federico of Urbino wasn't so lucky. Caught posing as a wandering friar to spy on a rival's fortress, he was recognized by a soldier who'd once served under him. The rival lord, furious at the breach of trust, had Federico's hands severed before sending him home as a lesson. The difference between these outcomes. Not the crime, but the victim's pride. A noble caught deceiving peasants might earn a slap on the wrist, but one fooling another aristocrat risked war. Some disguises backfired spectacularly in the courtroom. When Lady Elena of Castile was unmasked as the mysterious midwife Marie, who'd been delivering babies in plague-stricken slums, the bishop charged her with unseemly conduct. Her defense was razor-sharp. She produced a letter from the Queen thanking Marie for saving her nephew's illegitimate child. The scandal transformed Elena's trial into a political minefield. Punish her, and you insulted the crown. Acquit her, and you condoned noblewomen meddling in commoners' lives. The compromise, a token fine paid directly to the same poor families she'd served, framing her crime as charity gone too far. But the harshest punishments were reserved for nobles who used disguises to stoke rebellion. In 1512 Hungary, Baron Laszlo disguised himself as a tanner to organize a revolt against excessive royal taxes. When captured, his own class turned on him, not for the rebellion, but for degrading himself by sharing peasant beds and bread. The court stripped his titles, then forced him to wear his tanner's disguise while being drawn and quartered, a grisly reminder that some lines couldn't be uncrossed. Yet just decades earlier, King Matthias Corvinus had praised a lesser noble for nearly the same act, honoring him as a prince of the people, after he'd posed as a blacksmith to expose abusive landlords. The difference, Laszlo's revolt threatened the crown's coffers, while the blacksmith's exposé only hurt rival nobles. The ultimate irony, some rulers punished the disguise while adopting its lessons. After executing a group of nobles caught incognito among anti-tax rioters, Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV quietly implemented their demands, fixing the very injustices they'd risked their lives to expose. His proclamation made no mention of the dead rebels, crediting instead the wisdom of our loyal advisors. It was a masterclass in medieval spin: condemn the messenger but steal the message. These uneven punishments reveal a truth more damning than any deception. Justice wasn't blind in the Middle Ages, it winked. A noble's fate hinged not on fairness but on how useful or embarrassing their disguise proved to those in power. The real crime wasn't wearing rags, it was revealing how thin the fabric of privilege truly was. The ripple effects of nobles disguising themselves as peasants didn't fade with the Middle Ages. They cascaded through centuries, reshaping politics, art, and even the very idea of justice. Consider how these clandestine experiments in empathy fueled the fires of later revolutions. When French peasants stormed the Bastille in 1789, their cries for bread and equality weren't spontaneous. They echoed grievances first documented in secret ledgers by disguised nobles like the monk of Montauban. Those medieval undercover accounts had survived in banned pamphlets, passed hand to hand like tinder until they ignited the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Rousseau cited them as proof that inequality wasn't natural but engineered, a radical idea born from nobles who'd witnessed their own systems from the outside. Literature, too, was forever changed by these real-life masquerades. Shakespeare's Henry V prowling his camp in disguise didn't spring from pure imagination. It mirrored actual kings like Edward IV testing loyalty before battle. The trope of the noble in rags became a staple of Renaissance drama because audiences recognized its unsettling truth. Power could be arbitrary, and wisdom often wore a beggar's cloak. Even fairy tales absorbed these lessons. The prince disguised as a woodsman in Snow White or the princess hiding as a goose girl weren't just plot devices. They were cultural memories of a time when the highborn literally walked in commoners' shoes. But perhaps the most unexpected legacy was in governance itself. The undercover audits conducted by medieval rulers evolved into formal systems of accountability. Sweden's 18th century ombudsman, an official investigator of corruption, traced its roots to nobles like Count Raymond of Toulouse working incognito in vineyards to uncover abuse. Modern undercover journalism, where reporters infiltrate factories or slums to expose injustice, owes its methods to medieval queens like Margaret of Denmark posing as merchants' wives. The idea that leaders should see the world beyond their palaces didn't die. It institutionalized, transforming from clandestine espionage into transparency laws and social reforms. Yet for all its noble intentions, this legacy carried a dark paradox. The same disguises that exposed oppression also taught elites how to manipulate it. The spy networks of Venice's merchant diplomats became blueprints for colonial trade companies that exploited entire continents. The cunning of Louis XI, who used peasant gossip to crush rebellions, found echoes in the surveillance states of later centuries. Disguise had shown rulers both the humanity of their subjects and how easily that humanity could be managed, the ultimate testament to this phenomenon. Its enduring power to unsettle us. When a modern politician dons a hard hat for a staged factory visit, the public groans at the transparency of the act. That cynicism itself is the medieval legacy, a collective memory that true understanding requires more than costumes. The nobles who changed history weren't those who played peasant for a day, but those who let the experience rewrite their souls. And that's why their stories still resonate. They remind us that justice isn't about looking down from a throne, but about seeing eye to eye, even if it means getting dirt on your boots. Centuries may have passed since kings walked muddy roads in peasant rags, but the impulse to see the world through ordinary eyes hasn't vanished. It's just traded cloaks for cover stories. The hit TV show Undercover Boss might seem like light entertainment, but its premise is pure medieval strategy. CEOs scrubbing floors and hauling crates to uncover truths their boardrooms never reveal. Like Count Raymond toiling in vineyards, these modern executives often return shaken by the gaps between policy and reality. One fast food chain CEO, after working a drive-through shift incognito, slashed corporate bonuses to fund employee raises, a decision straight out of the secret ledger playbook. Yet today's disguises aren't always physical. Politicians create anonymous social media accounts to lurk in comment sections, absorbing unfiltered voter anger they'd never hear at staged town halls. A Scandinavian mayor recently confessed to posing as a single mother in a housing forum, where she learned more about bureaucratic delays in one night than from years of official reports. It's Harun al-Rashid's Baghdad night walks gone digital. Rulers still crave raw truth, even if it requires a fake profile photo. Some parallels are startlingly literal. Japan's railway executives still practice henshu, disguising themselves as passengers to catch service flaws, just as medieval dukes inspected roads as pilgrims. A German supermarket chain sends executives to shop incognito, noting which cashiers get scolded for giving hungry kids free fruit, echoing Elena of Aquitaine's undercover charity checks. Even the military has updated Bohemian's Antioch infiltration tactics. U.S. generals now pose as recruits to expose hazing, their hidden cameras replacing medieval daggers. But there's a crucial difference. Medieval nobles risked death if exposed. Today's leaders risk viral humiliation. When a tech billionaire's average Joe Reddit account was traced back to his private jet's Wi-Fi signal, the backlash wasn't just about deception. It highlighted how poorly he'd mimicked the struggles he claimed to understand. His miscalculation mirrored Duke Alenson's fatal error at Agincourt. Privileged habits are harder to hide than you think, the most telling evolution. Modern disguises often backfire faster. A British MP's anonymous blog praising his own policies was uncovered within hours, sparking memes comparing him to the Abbot of Unreason. Yet even failed attempts reveal something timeless. Power still fears looking foolish more than it fears ignorance. The Feast of Fools legacy lives on in every politician caught staging photo ops, proof that performance beats sincerity only until the mask slips. Perhaps the deepest lesson lies in what hasn't changed. Just as medieval rebels cited disguised nobles' eyewitness accounts to justify revolts, modern activists quote undercover investigations to demand reform. When a hospital CEO worked a shift as an orderly and then upgraded equipment, it proved the same thing W. Ladislaw of Poland learned. Truth moves fastest when it comes from someone who's lived it. The costumes may be different, but the calculus remains. Real leadership requires stepping off the pedestal, even if only long enough to remember what the ground feels like. Not every story of a noble trading silks for rags holds up under scrutiny. For every genuine account of a king walking incognito among his subjects, there are a dozen embellished tales where myth outshines reality. Take the famous legend of King Robert Bruce of Scotland, said to have learned perseverance from a spider while hiding in a peasant's hut. The story paints a poignant picture, a defeated king humbled by a lowly creature's determination. But dig deeper and the timeline unravels. Contemporary records show Bruce was rallying troops in Ireland during his supposed hermitage, and the spider motif didn't appear in chronicles until 2 centuries later. The tale wasn't a lie so much as a metaphor, a way to soften the brutal realities of guerrilla warfare into something more palatable for future generations. Then there's the enduring myth of Queen Elizabeth I sneaking into London's slums disguised as a milkmaid. The image of the Virgin Queen, her pale hands chapped from carrying pails, makes for romantic storytelling. But Elizabeth's meticulously recorded court calendars leave no gaps for such escapades, and her lifelong terror of assassination makes the idea wildly improbable. So why did the story persist? Because it served a purpose. It humanized a ruler who cultivated an almost divine image, giving her subjects a comforting narrative of a queen who cared enough to walk among them, even if she never actually did. Some fabrications were deliberate political tools. Ivan the Terrible's alleged habit of wandering Moscow as a beggar, for instance, appears mostly in foreign accounts written by his enemies. These stories often depicted him eavesdropping on conversations before executing the speakers, a clear attempt to paint the Tsar as paranoid. Yet Russian court documents from his reign contain no evidence of these incognito excursions. The legend likely grew from a kernel of truth. Ivan did employ a network of informants, but twisted it into Gothic horror to justify later revolts against his dynasty. Even verified cases sometimes crumble under scrutiny. The much-celebrated story of Marie Antoinette pretending to be a shepherdess at the Hameau de la Reine, her rustic retreat at Versailles, is often held up as proof of her detachment from reality. But letters from her attendants reveal the queen never actually role-played as a peasant. She visited the hamlet to escape court pressures, not to cosplay poverty. The damaging rumor spread because it fit a narrative that the aristocracy saw suffering as a game. What's fascinating isn't just the falsehoods, but why they stuck. These myths thrived because they filled a cultural need. A populace yearning for connection with the powerful clung to tales of compassionate rulers in disguise. Opponents of authoritarian regimes amplified stories of tyrants skulking in shadows, and rulers themselves sometimes encouraged the legends, recognizing their propaganda value. The line between fact and fiction blurred precisely because both sides, the governed and the governors, found uses for the deception, the most revealing test. Compare how different nations remember similar stories. In England, the good king in disguise trope often features monarchs redistributing wealth after witnessing hardship. In contrast, German and Eastern European variants tend to focus on rulers uncovering plots reflecting deeper cultural anxieties about betrayal. These aren't accidental variations, they're clues to what each society wanted from its leaders. So how do historians separate truth from tall tale? They look for the paper trail. Tax reforms enacted after a noble's undercover stint, court expenses for peasant clothing. Diaries from servants who helped with the disguise. Without these, even the most beloved stories remain just that, stories. But perhaps their enduring power lies less in their accuracy than in what they reveal about the timeless longing to believe that those in power might truly see us. After all, the fact that we still debate these centuries-old rumors proves something undeniable. The idea of a ruler willing to step off the throne, even fictionally, still captivates us. These disguised nobles weren't just playing dress-up, they were conducting an unspoken experiment in human nature, testing whether power could be wielded more justly when seen from below. At its core, every hidden journey into peasant life forced a reckoning with privilege. Imagine a duke accustomed to servants bowing as he passes, suddenly ignored in a marketplace, or a queen whose every whim was law, now bargaining for bread like any beggar. The shock wasn't just logistical, it was existential. Stripped of titles, they confronted the uncomfortable truth that respect and fear weren't the same, and that loyalty couldn't be bought with gold alone. What's striking is how often these experiences sparked real change. When Countess Matilda of Tuscany worked incognito in a 13th century hospital, her hands blistered from scrubbing floors, she didn't just donate coins afterward, she rewrote her estate's labor contracts, cutting serfs' workdays by hours. Her journals reveal why. A body remembers exhaustion longer than it remembers pity. This physical empathy, the blisters, the hunger, the vulnerability became a catalyst for reform in ways abstract reports never could. Leaders who'd felt the weight of a plow or the sting of a tax collector's scorn didn't just adjust policies, they internalized the cost of their own decisions. Yet the lesson wasn't universally noble. For every ruler like Matilda, another returned from disguise more cunning, not more compassionate. King Louis XI of France, after hearing merchants mock his wars while posing as a cloth trader, didn't rethink his campaigns. He raised tariffs on wool to bankrupt the loudest critics. His journals boast about the lesson taught, proving that exposure to suffering doesn't always breed mercy. Sometimes it just refines cruelty. This duality lies at the heart of noble disguises. They were mirrors, revealing not just society's flaws, but the character of those who peered into them. The most enduring legacy of these experiments, though, lies in their challenge to hierarchy itself. When a noblewoman like Isabella de Cousy chose to remain a weaver, or when Duke Wenceslaus traded his coronet for a plow, they exposed a radical idea: that class wasn't destiny. Their actions whispered a question that would echo through centuries. If a duke could be happy as a farmer, what did that say about the divine right of kings? No wonder so many disguised nobles faced ridicule or erasure from official records. Their very existence undermined the myths holding feudalism together. Perhaps that's why these stories still resonate. In an age where leaders are criticized for being out of touch, the image of a ruler willing to walk a mile in their people's shoes literally holds enduring power. The disguises may have been temporary, but the truths they uncovered were timeless. That justice looks different from the ground up, that wisdom often whispers where power shouts, and that no system built on blind obedience can withstand the gaze of someone who's seen both sides of the tapestry. From spies to saints, rebels to rulers, the nobles who dared to walk among peasants didn't just slip into disguises. They stepped into an entirely different world, one that reshaped their souls as much as their kingdoms. Think about the sheer audacity of that choice. These weren't just bored aristocrats slumming it for a day. They were rulers who risked everything, their safety, their status, even their lives, to see the unvarnished truth of the societies they governed. And what they discovered in those muddy streets and smoky taverns didn't just tweak policies, it sparked revolutions, toppled corrupt regimes, and rewrote the very definition of power. Take Elena of Aquitaine, who disguised herself as a merchant's wife to witness the suffering caused by her husband's wars. What she saw in those famine-stricken villages didn't just soften her heart, it hardened her resolve. She returned to court with a list of reforms so sweeping, her advisors balked. But Elena had an advantage no parchment could match: the memory of a child's hollow eyes staring up at her, unaware she held the power to change his fate. That's the real magic of these disguises. They transformed abstract suffering into personal stakes. A tax ledger might list numbers, but a noble who's felt the weight of an empty purse knows the cost in a way no report could convey. Then there's the flip side, the rulers who used anonymity as a weapon. Louis XI of France didn't wander his kingdom out of empathy. He did it to root out dissent before it could spread. His infamous network of commoner spies proved that disguises could be just as effective for control as for compassion. Yet even his cunning backfired at times. When rumors spread that the king himself walked among the people in disguise, Parisians began eyeing every beggar with suspicion, whispering jokes about the royal rat in our alley. The irony: in trying to make himself invisible, Louis made his presence felt everywhere. What unites all these stories, from the altruistic to the ruthless, is their enduring relevance. Today's leaders might swap cloaks for casual wear, but the principle remains: power distorts vision. The farther you are from the consequences of your decisions, the easier it is to make cruel ones. That's why these medieval experiments still resonate. They're not just history, they're a challenge. A reminder that leadership isn't about presiding from a distance. It's about closing the gap, even if only for a moment. So the next time you hear a tale of a king who worked as a blacksmith or a countess who tended plague victims, don't dismiss it as fantasy. See it for what it really was: one of history's most radical acts of humility. Because in a world built on rigid hierarchies, the bravest thing a noble could do wasn't winning a battle or amassing gold. It was daring to disappear, if only long enough to remember what it meant to be human. And that's a lesson that transcends centuries. If this journey into the shadows of the past has left you as fascinated as we are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation below. Who knows, maybe your own family's history holds a hidden chapter where titles were traded for truth. After all, the most extraordinary stories are often the ones waiting to be uncovered.